Over the years, the air maps in War Thunder have both grown in size and total amount. There are now about 40 ARB maps in the game, around 10 of which are used at top tier. Of those 10, about half are full-sized EC maps, which are only about 128 by 128 kilometers. The rest are a bit smaller, which by itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. However, when combined with 16-player teams, you really start to have furballs constantly. I'll say it again and again that the player count should be reduced to about 8v8 on smaller maps, and maybe 12v12 on larger maps. The main point of this video is about both map design and map size. Some of the current maps we have in game are not utilized quite as well as they could be. These could be fixed by changing the airfield locations on certain maps like Pyrenees for example. Rocky Canyon is a pretty good map in terms of design and layout. And in my opinion, it's the best overall map as it has a decent layout and quite a bit of different terrain and elevation changes. Also, real quick, if you guys enjoyed this video, please make sure to smash those like and subscribe buttons. I'm on my way to my next goal of 1,000 subscribers, and I really hope to reach it within a month or two. Also, I would like to thank my first and only YouTube member, so thank you again to Caden for being a member, and now let's get back to the rest of the video. On top of changing the layout of various maps, I think that we should have even larger maps than the current largest. I've come up with a list of map ideas that I think would be good additions to the game. I want to make sure it's very clear that maps larger than 128 by 128 would only be for Enduring Confrontation, whether that be for sim or for possibly realistic battles Enduring Confrontation. Of course, I realize there's two different main groups of people, where some want quicker games that don't last very long, and others who want Enduring Confrontation for ARB. I mentioned solutions for both of these groups when I made a video on improving ARB in War Thunder, where I mainly talked about how I'd have EC for RB setup. The idea behind these maps is a partial expansion upon that, but I won't go over everything in the other video here, but I would generally have a similar layout for these larger maps. However, there are a few things I would change. The first potentially being that you could have forward airfields that you could capture and lose throughout the battle. These wouldn't be too close to the border, but they would make it a little bit easier to rearm. I would also suggest that the maximum battle time be increased to 5 or 6 hours and the ticket amount be doubled. This would only be for the larger size maps, as their size would be truly massive compared to the current maps we have in game. There would also be an AWACS towards the back of the map for each team. With maps the size I'll be showing you, it'll be very important to have AWACS, and new functions will likely have to be added to utilize it properly. It could respawn 15 to 30 minutes after being destroyed, so that you won't lose it for the whole match, but the enemy can gain a bit of an advantage by destroying it. There should also be tankers for each team at various locations on their side of the map. There would also need to be an option to not auto-drop your drop tanks so that you can refuel them at the tanker. This will allow you to refuel much closer to the enemy and at higher altitudes, so you don't have to go all the way back down to an airfield. Both of these would also make longer range missiles like the Phoenix much more useful, as you could use them at their full ranges. To do this on maps this size, you would need to increase the max radar search range, which is currently limited to about 100 kilometers in the game. All the maps I have in mind are 512 by 512 kilometers in size, though at first I think that the current maps we have should be expanded. Maps like Pyrenees, Rocky Canyon, and Denmark, among others, should all be expanded to a bit of a larger size. With the larger sized maps, player counts could be even bigger while keeping the density the same or even a bit smaller. Maps the size of 512 by 512 would be 16 times the area of the current 128 by 128 maps that we have, meaning that we could have teams of 64 on each side. This would be 4 times the current max player count while being a quarter of the player density. I would suggest maybe to start with 32 player teams just to see how it would go, as there's a lot that will go into this outside of just making a larger map. Keep in mind that these maps can be broken up and have parts of them be used for regular ARB matches. It also may be a good idea to initially try this at a smaller scale and only use 256 square kilometer versions of the full map to test it out. Of course, there's a lot that will go into it, and way more that I can put into this one video, but it is an exciting idea, and I think if done properly, a lot of people can have a lot of fun. Before I get into what maps I would like to see, I want to cover why I would like to see maps of this size, and why I think it would be good as a whole. First, we will be getting longer and longer range weapons, which means we will need larger areas so you can have room to not have missiles immediately launched at you. These maps will also allow for more possibilities in the types of tasks you could do, and of course rewards would also need to be balanced, as it will take longer to do things like straight ground targets or bases. The size will also allow for some pretty cool maps and changing terrain. Also, like I had already mentioned, you can get smaller maps from normal ARB out of each, if not multiple different good ones. As for the first map, we'll be going from west to east, so we're starting off with the Bering Strait. All of these maps were marked out by hand to be as close to 512 by 512 as I could get them. With these distances, Gaijin will likely need to model the curvature of the Earth, which I think that they are fully capable of doing. As you can see, I attempted to make the land area as even as possible, though of course it could be perfected just a little bit. This is the first of 18 maps I have in mind, and as you can see, this map has quite a bit of water in it. Personally, I don't think that there's enough maps that have the ocean as part of them, so many of these will have a water aspect to them. As for the Bering Strait map, you would have airfields in Alaska and in Russia, and everything else for EC set up throughout the remaining map area. The next map is Hawaii, which would encompass the majority of the Hawaiian Islands. Currently, there is a Honolulu map, so they could either start from scratch or modify the existing map. On maps like this, with quite a large area covered by the ocean or other bodies of water, I would like to see full-on naval convoys as targets with destroyers as escorts. I would also like to see carrier strike groups on both sides as targets, and I think this would add a lot and it would be pretty cool to see entire strike groups, and of course having the objective of destroying the enemy's group or convoy. I will admit that this map could potentially be a little harder to balance, as the team who gets the southeastern part of the map will have a much larger land area, though there are definitely ways to make this work, possibly by using more naval assets for the northwestern team. Next, we have the Gulf of California, which starts just outside of Los Angeles and extends out to Phoenix and down into Mexico. This map still has some water in it, but not nearly as much as the others. In a scenario like this, you probably wouldn't have any convoys or strike groups, but you could still have plenty of naval targets, of course. Like I mentioned earlier, you would probably want to balance the area that both teams get, since with larger maps like these, you would rely on the ability to capture forward air bases, among other era assets, and even other things that would help you win the battle. For this map, I feel that the battle should be fought from north to south instead of east to west, as the western airfields would be too far from the border in my opinion, though of course the map could be shifted to make this work better. Take into account the size of these maps, as you would need quite a bit more airfields in order to make it work properly. The Great Lakes is the next area that I have mapped out. Again, on this map there is a fair amount of water, but not quite as much as the others. It covers the majority of the state of Michigan and 3 of the Great Lakes, those being Michigan, Erie, and Huron. For this map, you would likely have a northern team and a southern team in order to balance it correctly in terms of airfield placement. Where airfields can go is probably the largest part of balancing these maps, but it definitely isn't the only part. You also have to think about how big this map is, and that what may look tiny on this map is plenty of area to fit in an airfield. So just one little island can make everything work together. Next, we have a map that covers southern Florida to Cuba. The name of this could be the Straits of Florida, as this is the name of the water in between the Florida Keys and Cuba. It also covers a bit of the Bahamas, but as you can see, this is another map that has a large part of it being covered by water. Maps like these will work the best when we have more anti-ship weapons that will actually work properly, as the amount of naval targets on maps like these will be the primary targets by far. Again, I've tried to make it fairly even in terms of land area, and this map would probably be the best going from north to south. This next map is on the east coast of the United States, and there could possibly be a few names for it. These could be Chesapeake, Chesapeake Bay, or possibly the Appalachian Mountains. Though I don't think that the mountains take up enough of the map for the last name, but maybe it should be shifted a bit to the west to take up some more of the mountains with a little bit less of the Atlantic Ocean. A map like this with a lot more majority land area is easier to balance, which is good. This map extends from Baltimore down all the way through Virginia and most of the way through North Carolina. It also reaches a bit of West Virginia and unfortunately a bit of New Jersey, though luckily not too much. This would be another north-south map, as it's pretty hard to do east-west with an ocean taking up a bit of the eastern side, though of course this map could also be shifted to the west a little bit. Overall, I think that with the mountains, the bay, and the ocean, this would be a pretty cool and diverse map, at least in terms of landscape. Now, moving away from the US, we have the Andes Mountains in northern Chile. This is the first map that pretty much has no water aside from a lake in the north. It also may look pretty desolate, and I would agree it does through this map, but I still think it would be a pretty good mountainous map, as there's plenty of valleys and mountains. This map could either be north to south or east to west, and I think that it might be good to make both variations just to see a bit more variety in the same map. I also think that this would be a pretty good map for both air-to-air and air-to-ground combat, since you can hide from enemies and the enemy AWACS in the valleys and use them to evade missiles as well. The next map is the Strait of Gibraltar, which could either be named that or just Gibraltar. It goes from Morocco up to Spain and includes a bit of Portugal. I like this map since there's a decent amount of water, but it only takes up around half of the map. The two peninsulas creating the strait are good as well, since this could allow for more interesting placement of different assets and targets. Of course, this would be another north-south map setup based on the way the land is set up. I also think that the strait would be a good naval EC map if set up properly. Though all of these maps would have to be worked on and set up properly to work the best, of course, but I definitely think it's doable. Now, we have Great Britain and Ireland with the Irish Sea and St. George's Channel as the center. This would definitely be an east-west setup for teams, and I think it may need to be shifted a little for balance, but to be fair, it doesn't matter quite as much as a ground battle would, since with an EC map this large, you can absolutely set it up to be a lot of fun and be balanced. There is quite a bit of water in this map, but not as much as others, and I like that the Isle of Man is towards the center, and I think it could be a lot of fun to land there and take off to intercept people in various planes. I also like the idea of having a large channel of water in between two land masses, similar to the Dover Strait map we have in game, just much larger. This map would also be a lot more diverse in its land formations than a map like Dover Strait, just because of the size and location. Next up is the Aegean Sea, which extends from Greece over to Turkey. While for most maps you could have smaller 256 by 256 maps to start out, or just for more options, I feel like this may not work as well here, that you could definitely make a few 128 by 128 or smaller maps out of this. This is an important point that I would like to reinforce, that just because there is a large map like this does not mean it can only be used at its maximum size. This is an important point that I want to reinforce, that just because there's a large map like this absolutely does not mean that it can only be used at its maximum size. In fact, many of these maps I'm showing could have multiple smaller maps and variations made from them to be used in either smaller EC matches or for a regular ARB. For this full 512 square kilometer map, you would be in a left to right setup, and with all of these islands, you could have a pretty good setup with having bombing targets and other strategic points on these islands, as well as having ships in the sea. Overall, I think this would be a pretty good map and would be a lot of fun to play on. The next map we have is fairly close, being Cyprus over to Lebanon and Syria and up to Turkey. This is a bit of a harder map to set up, but here I would have one team set up towards the top left corner and the other team would be set up towards the bottom right corner. There could also be airfields on Cyprus that you could capture or then later lose to the enemy, or vice versa. This mechanic would have to be thought over a lot, and I'm probably getting into a lot of complicated future things that likely won't happen, but I would still love to see something like it. I definitely think that a map like this could work, and it would be a lot of fun if done correctly. Honestly, I would love to go even deeper into how everything would be set up, but to do that for just one map, it would take a long time, but maybe I might do it at some point. Now, we move over to the Persian Gulf, which includes part of Qatar, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. The way I have this map set up currently is okay, but I think it may need to be shifted up just a bit more to make it a little more balanced, but it isn't too bad. I do think this would be a good map overall, but it is a bit lower on the list in terms of my favorites, since aside from Iran, it is mostly just a flat desert, though the water and the islands are nice. I know you're probably getting tired of hearing this, but this would be another north to south map. I do think it would be pretty cool to have combat over the Persian Gulf and over places like Qatar and Dubai. Next up is one of my favorite maps, the Himalayas. This map covers a few different countries, mainly India, Nepal, and China. This one would be yet another north to south map, however this one has next to no water outside of a couple lakes in the north. The dividing line between the two sides is the Himalayas, of course, with Mount Everest being pretty much at the exact center of the map. Having the largest mountain in the world, along with many of the other highest in the same mountain range, this would allow for a lot of coverage so that you can use them as cover to hide from the enemy, whether you are trying to sneak closer to shoot down their AWACS, tankers, or strike ground targets, among many other things. I also just think it would be a lot of fun to fly through the Himalayan mountains with them being so big. You can also try this map from east to west, but I would say the main way should be north to south, like I already mentioned, so you can have the mountains as a dividing line between the teams. The next map we have is Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore. This is similar to the UK map I went over earlier, where you have two islands separated by a body of water. For this map, you would be doing northeast to southwest so you could have the separation with the water. On this map, I would probably have some ships and other naval targets in the channel between the two main islands, and plenty of different land-based targets on the main islands. This map doesn't have quite as much elevation variation as some of the other maps, but I still think it is pretty good overall and would be very enjoyable to play on, especially with the scenery. Next up, we have another island nation in Southeast Asia, the Philippines. This map could be shifted to the east a bit, or possibly even rotated a little counterclockwise, then be shifted to the right as an even better setup. To my knowledge, all the maps in the game are made with the north facing up, but I could be wrong here, and even if I'm not, there's no reason they can't do this now. Of course, this map would be set up from top to bottom, and I think it'd be pretty good and a bit unique as it has a lot of decently large islands all spread out across the map. This would actually be a proper archipelago map where you can have quite a bit of land and have it separated by the ocean, which in my opinion would be very cool and a lot of fun to play on. Of course, the main idea behind all of these maps is to have them be both enjoyable and have them be able to just play well in general. The next map spans from South Korea across to the southernmost islands of Japan. The name of this could be the Tsushima Strait, as this is what is at the center of the map. The map overall may need to be shifted a bit more into South Korea for maximum balance. This map covers cities such as Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan, and Daegu and Busan in South Korea. This map could also use the Shimoyama Island in the center as a contested area, where there could possibly be an airfield or two that teams could capture back and forth. I feel like this map could definitely be good for both air-to-air and air-to-ground combat, but I also think that there's a possibility that air-to-air will be a bit better as there's a large body of water in the center of the map, so there isn't as much cover. However, due to the fact that the player density is much lower, despite the larger player count, you should see less people roaming around and just have a lower chance in general of stumbling upon an enemy. Of course, this would only work if everything was set up properly and was changed from the current Enduring Confrontation setup, but again, this is completely doable and I have some more suggestions on top of my video that I already made on EC. Onto the second to last map, we have Tasmania. This is a bit of a harder map to balance or set up, but there are a few ways to do it. The full square I have drawn here is about 512 by 512, however you could use a bit of a smaller one on only the main island of Tasmania and drop the two northern islands and just go from north to south. The other option would be to keep the current size and have the northern team have airfields on the northern two islands and initially control some of the main island. There would be forward airfields on the main island that could be captured as well as other normal assets and targets that could be struck by the team from the south. This map would absolutely take a bit more work than some others to get right, but I definitely think it would be pretty cool if they did make it work. Of course, the maps they already make do take a while, so I'm sure it would take even longer for these larger maps, but I definitely think it would be worth it, especially when you can get multiple smaller ones out of these bigger ones. The last map I have in mind is New Zealand. As you can see, it covers parts of both the northern and southern islands. This is another map that has the two sides separated by a body of water, and this time it gets a little more interesting with its formation. The mountain range on the southern island and the formation of land at the top edge of the southern island are both pretty incredible. You may say that the mountains in the south provide an advantage as cover, but I would argue it won't work as well here as you would think, since they run parallel to where the northern team is coming from. Of course, they can still be utilized for cover a little bit, but being further at the back of the map, I don't think it'll be a very big issue, if at all. I also think that this is another map that could be used for naval EC in at least the center of the map, if not a few other places. There's also other maps I mentioned where I didn't specifically mention being used for naval battles, but there were plenty that could be. I also haven't mentioned it so far, but there are locations on many of these maps that could be used for ground battles, but that list could get pretty big real fast. While I finish up this video, I want to remind you that initially I think that some of these maps we have in game already should be changed in the way that they're utilized, as some of them can be used so much better than they currently are. I already mentioned it a little bit and I didn't go into detail very much, but I also think that there's some pretty simple changes that are needed. Also, I think that many of the current maps should be expanded first as a bit of a stopgap. I also want to be clear that the maps of the sizes I was showing would only be used for the highest tiers with very long range weapons. Of course, smaller versions can be used for lower tiers and regular ARB, however, the point of these larger maps is to make things more spread out and have the ability to utilize these longer range weapons that will be added soon. As well as, you don't have to be packed into such a relatively small area when your enemies have these as well. If done right, I think this will be better for both people doing ground strike missions and those doing air combat missions. With a lower player density, even at 64 players per team, you will have so much more space to yourself, not even taking into account that you'd be very unlikely to see a full lobby, at least looking at how sim lobbies typically look. I will admit that sim is a bit different, and if RBEC were to be added, it would absolutely be more popular, but I still think it would be possible to find a match without a full player count. Please let me know in the comments what you think about the ideas I shared in this video, both the maps themselves and everything else. Whether you disagree or have anything to add, please do so, as it will allow for more conversations about these topics in the community. Again, as I wrap up, I do truly believe that a large part of the community would enjoy EC on maps of these sizes. Yet I also want to stress that it 100% depends on if it is set up properly or not. Of course, I would have to think about each individual map, however in my mind, I could definitely see this as a possibility, though I would be surprised if Gaijin were to take any sort of suggestions, as that isn't something they like to do a lot of. If you guys haven't already, please make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons if you enjoyed this video.